Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we are going to be talking about Essential Ghost Rider, Volume 1. So, several years ago, Marvel Comics actually put out several reprints, black and white reprints of classic comic book series that they had back in the day. And you had stuff like Marvel Team Up, Marvel 2-in-1, X-Men, Avengers, Hulk, and of course, in this case, Ghost Rider. And, basically, they'd have, say like either the earliest issues or sometimes all of the issues of a series reprinted in these particular types of essential books. And while on one hand, from a collector's standpoint, let me phrase that, for fans of a certain series, this could be a good thing, because if the whole series was collected in these trade paperbacks, they were relatively cheap ways to be able to get a hold of an entire series without shelling out, say, an arm and a leg for the original issues. And so another thing, depending on your perspective, is that because of the black and white artwork and the lack of color, you got a different take on the quality of the artwork within the series. Case in point, I'll show you just an example here. This page right here with artwork by Jim Mooney. If you look at it here, with the black and white, there's a lot more time to appreciate the detail, and it's a lot more visible, and in terms of like the effort that's put into it. Whereas oftentimes, if you look at the color of a comic book from an earlier series, like say the 60s or 70s, the coloring can be flat at times. And I've seen pictures from some of the stories that are collected in this volume, and for the most part, the coloring does tend to be comparatively bland to, say, stuff that came later on, like say the 80s or 90s. And so in some ways, I think that these essential books had a good idea as far as re-releasing the stories in black and white form, because it really gave the reader a chance to appreciate the amount of effort that went into creating the artwork for a series. But on the flip side of that, these were, because of the cheapness of the production on these books, they weren't really meant to stand up to a lot of damage, and so they bend easily. The pages themselves don't really hold up to wear and tear very well. And I actually got this particular book off of Amazon, and it was, I knew it going in advance it was a used copy, but at the same time though, it's just I remember having a couple of these back in the day. Not the Ghost Riders, but like I had a couple of X-Men essential books, and I mean, I love the stories, but I just remember being disappointed at how easily the books were capable of being beaten up. And so another thing is that sometimes the production team of the essential lines, they did a really good job of actually putting in essential stories within the essential series of a particular book, but sometimes they would drop the ball. Like a case in point, there's an enemy of Ghost Riders that was introduced in an issue of a comic book series called Marvel 2-in-1, which was essentially a Spider-Man team-up series. Like, Spider-Man was the regular character, but he would team up with a different character in the Marvel Universe in almost every issue, or it may be one character for 2 or 3 issues, that kind of thing. But I believe it was in Marvel Team Up, Number 15, it introduced this villain by the name of the Orb, who would go on to become what you would call a classic villain of the Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider. And he does show up in this volume, but because they make reference to that particular story in some of these issues, but they don't actually include that story, it leads to some confusing moments, or it did for me at least, because I didn't really get what was going on in relation to certain events that were referred to from that particular story. I mean, I got the gist of it, but because that story wasn't placed in this collection, I think the emotional impact of, say, having the Orb show up again and going one-on-one with Johnny Blaze, I mean, I think the emotional impact was somewhat dulled because that particular issue was missing. So that's just one example of something that could happen sometimes with these essential books. Like there'll be references to other story, like say other issues from other books that were out at the time that say a certain character from the Essential series is a part of. In this case, like I said, it happened with that issue of Marvel 2-in-1, but it also happens with an issue of, Marvel Team Up. But it also happens with an issue of Marvel 2-in-1, specifically Marvel 2-in-1 number 8. And that was a comic book series that came out around a similar time as Marvel Team Up. It was a similar concept, but instead of a Spider-Man Team Up series, it was a Thing from the Fantastic Four Team Up series. And the formula was very similar. He would team up with a different character in the Marvel Universe every couple of issues. And in the case of Marvel 2-in-1 number 8, he apparently teamed up with Ghost Rider, and the two of them fought a villain called Miracle Man. And so that particular storyline is referenced, complete with flashback pictures, but the Miracle Man only shows up in, say, that particular flashback, or say in a hallucination or something like that. And so that is something that I found to be problematic in terms of being able to read and enjoy the stories in this particular collection, because more than once there would be references to Johnny Blaze, say, interacting with certain characters within the Marvel Universe in series that were outside of this book, but because those particular issues aren't available here, or they aren't reprinted, it just has the reader being left with a kind of what's going on here? And I think most problematic as far as that particular issue is the fact that around the time of these earlier issues, Johnny Blaze was a part of a short-lived superhero team called the Champions, which had the characters of Hercules, the Angel, and Iceman, yes, the two members of the X-Men, as well as Black Widow from the Avengers. And so Johnny Blaze was a part of this, strangely makeshift team. And I don't know if the series was any good, but by most accounts it really wasn't, because the creative teams didn't really know what to do with the characters, and especially in the case of Johnny Blaze, because he was supposed to be a loner character, and here he is, trying to fit in with a bunch of superheroes, or a small group of superheroes that, he hardly had anything in common with. And so there are references to the first 4 issues of that series, and yes, Johnny Blaze does have a brief interaction or two with certain characters from that group, but other than that, and say a crazy hallucination toward the end of this collection, those particular issues, like they're referenced, but they aren't collected here. And so there'll be references to, say, something tragic happening to one of the team members, and Johnny Blaze being really torn up about it, And, you're like, well, I mean, I'd appreciate the tragedy of the situation if I could have seen what was going on, because it's not in this volume. So, anyway, that's kind of, where these essential books, these Marvel essential books, were a bit of a mixed blessing. So you'd have, I mean, depending on how well the production teams did at their jobs of putting these books together, I mean, the results were oftentimes haphazard, because they would leave out certain stories that were taking place with these characters at the same time that these issues were written. And so when you make references to these outside stories that are apparently very important to this character, but you don't bother to include them, you're kind of like, well, it's called essential, so why are you leaving out an essential story? But that's just my opinion on the matter. And another thing is that I found that in the table of contents, where it's showing the creative teams for each issue that was reprinted, there's at least one instance in which, for some reason, they credit the wrong writer with a story. I believe it was issue number 12 or number 11. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. It was number, yeah, give me a sec here. Sorry about that. Yeah, for some reason, they have the writer of issue number 11 credited as Steve Gerber. Issue 11 of the Ghost Rider issues that were reprinted here. And then Steve Gerber is a fantastic writer. I mean, he gave us, Howard the Duck. He wrote some of the best Man-Thing stories, but he unfortunately didn't actually do any of the issues of Ghost Rider in here. It would have been awesome if he'd had, but he didn't. But for some reason, they have him credited in the table of contents as the writer of that particular issue, when it was in fact Tony Isabella. So, I mean, just kind of like a bit of sloppiness on the production team's part, as far as, the production team that put this particular book together. So anyway, though, that's kind of my take on the whole Marvel Essential line. Some mixed blessings as far as that goes. But anyway, though, this particular volume collects issues 5 through 12 of the comic book series Marvel Spotlight, as well as issues 1 through 20 of the first ongoing series of Ghost Rider, specifically, the Ghost Rider series that featured Johnny Blaze as the main character, as well as issue 138 of the Daredevil series, because there is a point where the last two issue stories in this volume are essentially a crossover, between Daredevil 138 and Ghost Rider issue number 20. So there's that. But so I gotta say that I guess we should get into the actual story of who and what Ghost Rider is. A lot of people are probably more familiar with Ghost Rider because either they've seen the two Nicolas Cage movies that came out in the early 2000s, or we'll just say the 2000s, as well as the Robbie Reyes character that was portrayed on screen, on the TV screen, for the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So most people are probably going to be more familiar with the character in one of those two live-action depictions. But he was, in fact, introduced in issue number 5 of Marvel Spotlight. And it was in August of 1972. And there's a lot of debate as to who the actual creators of Ghost Rider, aka Johnny Blaze, really are. But arguably the most accepted answer to that question of who's his real daddy, so to speak, is kind of a group collaboration. There was writer Gary Friedrich, And then editor-in-chief at Marvel, Roy Thomas, who also was a really good, swords and sorcery writer, but yes, he was an editor at the time. Edited artist Mike Ploog, who was a fantastic horror artist. And you also had Stan Lee, who apparently came up with the name of Johnny Blaze. And so, depending on who you talk to, these individuals, specifically these first three individuals, are the ones who are usually given the most credit in terms of who created Ghost Rider and character Johnny Blaze. But if you've seen the movie of Ghost Rider, I mean, as lackluster as I found the movie to be, I will say that they did a pretty faithful job of, at the very least, getting the basics down as to how Johnny Blaze became Ghost Rider. So the gist is, Johnny Blaze is a world famous stunt cyclist, and he works in this show that's run by a master stunt cyclist by the name of Crash Simpson. And Crash Simpson is like his foster father. He took him in after his parents had died, and so he had a foster sister in the character of Roxanne Simpson. And so you have this interesting sibling type of relation, or pseudo sibling type of relationship, and with Crash Simpson being the surrogate father to Blaze. But gradually, Johnny Blaze and Roxanne Simpson, they become more than foster siblings. They actually fall in love and what have you. But Johnny Blaze at this point is a young man. He's still trying to figure stuff out, and she's a young woman, and same thing with her. And it turns out that Johnny Blaze had a rather traumatic incident happen, wherein his foster mother, Crash Simpson's wife, had died in a motorcycle-related accident, and she was in fact trying to save Johnny Blaze, but she gets caught in an explosion, and as she's dying as she's on her deathbed, she makes Johnny Blaze promise not to ride in the shows anymore, because she doesn't want him to get killed, much like his own biological father was. And so for whatever reason, he doesn't confide this to Crash Simpson, his foster father. You think he would, because the fact that his foster mom and Crash Simpson's wife had just basically on her deathbed made Johnny Blaze promise not to ride anymore, and Blaze being a champion level rider, you'd think that would bear some sort of having some sort of conversation with Crash, saying, hey, your wife, my foster mom just made me promise not to ride anymore, so I'm not trying to chicken out here, but it's a deathbed request, man, I'm sorry. But he doesn't tell Crash Simpson that, and so for quite some time afterwards, both Crash and Roxanne think that Johnny Blaze has gone yellow, or he's turned coward. But Blaze starts trying to figure out, okay, I promised I wouldn't ride in the shows, but she didn't say anything about riding in general. And so late at night, when no one's around, he would get some riding in, and Roxanne Simpson, she sees him one night and figures out 2 and 2, or she puts 2 and 2 together, but for whatever reason, though, neither of them think to tell Crash Simpson what's really going on. But Crash Simpson is actually doing really well in his career, and he's about to get to a point where they're hitting a level of prestige that most cyclists can only dream of. But instead of being really happy about it, he's saying, who cares about that at this point? And so Blaze and Johnny Blaze and Roxanne Simpson, they're like, oh, what's going on? Why are you so bummed out when we've got this amazing opportunity? And so basically, on one hand, he still thinks that Johnny Blaze is a coward who can't be bothered to take a shot at the show, or being, a championship rider that he's clearly capable of being. But on the other hand, he had recently found out that he has a, an incurable blood disease. And the doctors only gave him like a month or so to live. And so naturally, this throws everything into turmoil, and everyone's devastated. And Johnny Blaze, at this point, decides, okay, well, I'm going to make a deal with the devil. So, rather than, trying to, talk to people about it, like medical specialists or something like that, rather than, say, trying to, work together as a family to maybe get a second opinion. I mean, I know this was in the 70s, but, surely, medical treatment may have been available to some extent that, if they just looked around, I don't know. But then again, maybe it wasn't available. And maybe that's why Johnny Blaze was so desperate to literally make a deal with the devil. But against all logic, Johnny Blaze decides, okay, yeah, I'm going to make a deal with the devil. And so he pulls out, all the stops and performs this occult ceremony wherein he literally summons the devil and makes a deal wherein he says, hey, if you'll keep Crash Simpson from dying from the disease, I'll give you my soul to do with whatever as you wish. And so the devil says, done. And so fast forward a short time later, Crash Simpson has decided to go ahead and go through with this epic stunt at this, major show that they've been given the opportunity to do, that they had been talking about earlier. And so it's a very dangerous stunt. And so, at first, Roxanne and, Johnny Blaze and a lot of the other people in the crew are like, hey, Crash, are you sure you can pull this off? Not everyone knows about his, incurable blood disease, but they know that this is a very dangerous stunt. And Crash is like, in his mind, he's thinking, okay, may as well just, go out in a blaze of glory, worst case scenario. And Johnny Blaze is thinking to himself, okay, he's got this. Satan said that he's not going to die by the blood disease. And lo and behold, Crash Simpson, in attempting to make the jump, crashes and burns. And so, Blaze, naturally is, traumatized by this, as is, Roxanne Simpson. I'm sorry. Roxanne Simpson. The two of them are naturally, traumatized by this. But Blaze, later on that night, he has a kind of a throwdown with the devil, sort of a verbal throwdown, wherein, the devil comes to claim his due, and Blaze is like, you got a lot of gall for coming to take my soul when you didn't keep your end of the bargain. He was supposed to live. And the devil says, I said he wouldn't die by the blood disease. I never said he wouldn't die in the stunt. And so I kept my end of the bargain. Now your soul is mine. But somehow Roxanne Simpson, she's able to barge in at just the right time and use some secondhand occult knowledge to temporarily banish the devil or Satan from Johnny Blaze's path. And at first, they're thinking, we did it. Somehow we beat the devil. But it turns out that while Johnny Blaze's soul is still his, the devil had actually partially cursed him at this point, and basically had given him the power of a literal demon from hell, wherein at night he transforms into the being known as Ghost Rider. And so Ghost Rider at this point has basically the abilities to use hellfire on his enemies. And he in his Ghost Rider form, he's also capable of taking far more damage than, say, Blaze is in his human form. And at this point in time, Blaze and Ghost Rider are seemingly one and the same, but this would change as the series went on. But at this point in time, it's more like, Johnny Blaze, I mean, he still retains his, identity whenever he turns into Ghost Rider, but when he does turn into Ghost Rider, he physically transforms. He still has the Johnny Blaze personality. But so that's the basic setup of the series, is that while he still has these demonic abilities, I mean, he still has a soul, but Satan at this point is constantly trying to, get this guy's soul, because he doesn't like, having, his bargains turned against him, or he doesn't like being cheated. And so despite the fact that, the devil has a billion other people in the world that are involved in all sorts of morally despicable activities, he instead seems to be focusing specifically on Johnny Blaze, because maybe it's because he already invested a certain amount of power in this guy, and he's wanting a return on his investments. I don't really know. I mean, they don't really do a good job, in my opinion, of really explaining why. But basically, throughout this volume, Johnny Blaze goes up against multiple foes, and some of them are blatantly demonic. I mean, they're clearly from hell, and others are seemingly ordinary foes, like supervillains or ordinary human criminals. But somehow or another, it always comes back to Satan. I mean, if it's Joe Blow interacting with Johnny Blaze and giving him like a seemingly helpful information or something like that, odds are Joe Blow is actually an agent of Satan. If you have a supervillain show up one day with vaguely say ulterior motives, odds are he or she is an agent of Satan. And so that, I think, is one of the problems, is that the occult element is obviously a part of Ghost Rider's story. It's a very important part, as is the whole deal with the devil bit. And it's very possible to make good horror stories with stuff like this. But the problem is that, amongst other things, the creative teams, they kept on going back to the devil. Anytime, they started to explore further possibilities with the character of Johnny Blaze and Roxanne, as well as, Roxanne Simpson, or say anytime they brought in a foe who was somewhat intriguing, that intrigue and potential was dampened by the fact that 9 times out of 10, this foe would inevitably be an agent of Satan somehow. And so, I mean, yes, you could get into the whole spiritual aspect of things, of how maybe they were trying to go for, I guess, the more Judeo-Christian version of hell, or heaven and hell, wherein Satan's responsible for all the ills in the world. But then again, you're kind of like, well, wait a minute, look at all these other comic book series where you have all these other villains, and they're their own agents. I mean, it's up for debate as to whether where heaven and hell, or God and the devil, fall behind the scenes on stuff like this. But this is probably like the one series I could think of off the top of my head wherein literally just about every villain was somehow an agent of Satan. Like, they would always have some big revelatory moment where you're initially thinking that they might be like their own agent or something, but then it turns out, nope, they're an agent of Satan. Like, they literally come out and say it. So I think that was one of the main problems of the series. But the other thing is that there was a constantly revolving door of creative teams. Case in point, the writer, Gary Friedrich, he wrote issues 5 through 12 of Marvel Spotlight. And let's see, give me a sec here to get my notes together. He wrote 5 through 12 of Marvel Spotlight, issues 1 through 4 of the ongoing Ghost Rider series, as well as issue 6. And then you had Tony Isabella he came in and wrote issues 7 through 9, 11 through 15, and 17 through 19. And then you had Marv Wolfman, who filled in and wrote issue 5 with a script by Doug Moenik. And he also wrote issue 20 of the series, of the Ghost Rider series. And I should say he wrote it. He and Doug Moenik, they wrote issue 5 of the Ghost Rider series. And also Marv Wolfman wrote issue 138 of the Daredevil series. And last but not least, Bill Mantlo wrote issue 16, what was most definitely a fill-in story. So anyway, though, what ended up happening, though, is like with this constant shifting of creative teams, anytime there seemed to be some form of creative stability for the book at this point in the series, it was often undone whenever the next creative team came into play. And I shouldn't say that, when I say creative team, I mean, it's like, the writers and artists. But the thing is, the artwork in this book is generally pretty good. You've got a stable of genuinely talented comic book artists working on this series. I mean, you had, of course, you have Mike Ploog, one of the co-creators of Johnny Blaze. He was a very skilled horror artist, as I mentioned earlier. But he wrote, he illustrated Marvel Spotlight issues, 5 through 8. And you had the great Jim Mooney, who illustrated issues 2 through 9 of the Ghost Rider series. And, and John Byrne, some of his early work is on hand here with the issue of Daredevil 138 as well as Ghost Rider 20. And also you have Sal Buscema doing some guest work on issue number 11. And Frank Robbins, he did issue 12 and 17 through 19. So basically, also you have Tom Sutton, who did Marvel Spotlight issues 9 through 11 and Ghost Rider 1. So you look at the artwork here, you have some really neat imagery, and you breeze through the book here, and it's a cool book to look at. Visually speaking, you're constantly going to be finding stuff to pause for a few moments and just take a look at. I mean, whether it be say the monsters and demons that are on hand in the earlier issues, or say the more mundane criminal activity in the later issues, or moments when Ghost Rider or Johnny Blaze is being introspective about something. I mean, the artwork tends to be pretty good. In fact, there's a really neat chase scene in one of the issues that's on this really crowded freeway, and there's like this really neat double-page spread wherein you see the orb being pursued by Johnny Blaze, and basically, if I can find it, give me a moment. Here we are. I don't know how well y'all can see it on here, but yeah, that's Ghost Rider in the back there. That's the orb on the motorcycle up there. And between them are a lot of oncoming and ongoing cars. So, I mean, depending on the occasion, I mean, the artists were very versatile. I mean, you had, some good horror art, you had some good action scenes. And so this book, at this point in time, especially, I mean, the book looked good. It's just that mainly the writers, I think, were the main problem. Either the story arcs they had weren't they might have been creative or good for the time, but you look at them now, and a lot of the writing's pretty cheesy. Like especially, and I don't mean any disrespect to Gary Friedrich as a person. I'm sure he's a nice guy, and I'm pretty sure I read some stuff by him at some point that was actually pretty good. I don't remember what it was, but I know I've come across the name several times in some of the stuff I've read. But whenever he was writing, the character Ghost Rider, anytime the villains were revealed to be agents of Satan, the revelations tended to come across as very overdramatic in his hands, and that unfortunately detracted from the momentum of the stories that he was writing, because visually speaking, I think some of the supernatural elements looked the best whenever he was writing, and artists like Mike Ploog and Tom Sutton were handling the artwork, and of course Jim Mooney did some of the artwork as well during Friedrich's run. But on the other hand, though, I think Tony Isabella had a better knack for writing, say, more down-to-earth dialogue when it came to, say, human interaction with the characters. And I like the idea of Johnny Blaze trying to break away from, say, being an agent of Satan and trying to be his own man, and getting a career that utilized his stunt capabilities, and him trying to overtly be a hero as well. But unfortunately, it always came back to Satan somehow. And whenever that happened, I think Tony Isabella, he had some interesting ideas, but unfortunately, it sort of clashed with everything that was established already. Like at one point, Johnny Blaze is literally saved by Jesus, although in the issue it happens, Jesus is just called a friend or the friend. And for the time, it's a really powerful moment, because it's a point where Satan or whoever's posing as Satan, basically has Johnny Blaze at his mercy, and is this close to taking his soul to hell, when the friend comes out and tells him to back off, and Johnny Blaze's only sin was desperation, and everyone has to deal with Satan multiple times in their life, and Johnny Blaze deserves a second chance, and so Satan backs off, but basically saying, I'll be back, and you look at it now, some of the writing, the scripting might be a little cheesy, but plot-wise, it was a really powerful moment. And as far as Tony Isabella goes, it was definitely a signature moment for his run on the series. But apparently one of the things he wanted to do towards the end of his run was to have Johnny Blaze still hold onto his Ghost Rider capabilities, because at one point, a couple points, he finds that using his abilities for good gives him more control of his abilities. So basically, he's not having to rely on nighttime transformations to turn to Ghost Rider. Like he can turn to Ghost Rider during the day if he's trying to save someone. So I liked that particular attempt to explore the morality side of things when it comes to, say, using a demonic power but for good. So I think Tony Isabella was definitely onto something there. But the problem was when he brought Jesus into it. While it was a powerful moment, one of the things he wanted to have happen, though, apparently, if you read about, behind the scenes stuff, he was wanting to have Johnny Blaze become a born again Christian while still maintaining, using his powers for good. And so in the last issue that he was credited with writing, issue 19, his name's on it, but in fact, a guy named Jim Shooter, who was a mover and shaker at Marvel at the time, and then beyond that, actually got a hold of the issue, before it could hit the presses, and basically tore up the original scripts, and also and had some people rewrite it. I mean, I think he did the rewriting, but basically you have a story that's credited to Tony Isabella, but it's essentially ghost written by Jim Shooter, and you find out that everything. I mean, it harkens back to Gary Friedrich's run, in the sense that everything's tied to the devil again. And it's a really frustrating moment, because while Tony Isabella's work on the series, I mean, it's nothing I would say that was like, I don't know, Oscar winning, or anything that could be in the same league as, say, someone like Alan Moore or something like that. But in my opinion, his work on the series was far more intriguing and filled with potential than Gary Friedrich's, simply because Gary Friedrich kept on falling back to Satan, 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 whereas Tony Isabella, I mean, he kind of did that, but he tried to explore the more morality side of things, like when it came to this character with demonic capabilities, but trying to be his own person. And the fact that his final story has his name on it, but he didn't even write it as it was released, I mean, it's kind of a slap in the face. I mean, not only to him, but to people who were reading the series at the time, because while he may have been aware that this was the last issue he was going to write, he didn't even, have, they didn't even, the creative, the people that were pulling the strings or what have you, didn't even, have the decency to let him end the book on the note he wanted to end it on. And when you hear Jim Shooter's side of things, like in interviews and stuff, I think the main reason he did that was because he objected to the Marvel universe in its entirety being a explicitly Christian universe, in the sense that while yes, there's all these fantastical elements, there's only one God and all that. And so basically that was his objection, because in his eyes, Tony Isabella bringing Jesus into the equation made it to where Ghost Rider, the Ghost Rider book, and the Marvel universe as a whole was falling under the biblical God. And so one God, one devil, and all that. And he felt that would alienate a lot of readers who, say, weren't Christian. And I can understand that logic. And I have my own beliefs on when it comes to religion and stuff like that. I mean, I grew up Christian, but I'm more agnostic these days. But I mean, I can kind of see both sides of it. I mean, I think Tony Isabella's decision would have been a very interesting twist for the character. I mean, and that was the point, that he was clearly, pushing Johnny Blaze down. But at the same time, though, Jim Shooter had a point as well, in the sense that, I mean, yes, there's a heaven and a hell, there's a God and a devil, but how do we know as human beings that one or the other is the right heaven or hell? And so as I can understand Jim Shooter objecting to that, and I could have, but at the same time, for him to basically take it entirely out of Tony Isabella's hands at the last second and totally rewrite the issue, I think was kind of a dick move. I mean, that's just my opinion on the matter. But yeah, so I had very mixed feelings on this book. I think that there are definitely some classic moments within the Ghost Rider lore that are on hand here. Like, for example, you have under Gary Friedrich's run, you have the character of Witch Woman being introduced, as well as the son of Satan, who's an anti-hero who's literally the son of Satan. And so while both of these characters, yes, they go back to being agents of Satan or involved with Satan in some way, they are interesting characters. Son of Satan, sort of, I mean, he's definitely a demonic character, But ironically, because of his own vendetta with his dad, Satan, he ends up helping Johnny Blaze out from time to time. So his character was interesting. In Witch Woman, I think, while she unfortunately was an agent of Satan initially, I did like her character because, when you're exploring her backstory, I mean, you have, Native American. She's a Native American who ends up, being taken captive by a group of Satanists, and basically against her will, becoming a pawn of Satan. And she kind of goes back and forth between being a willing pawn of Satan and an unwilling pawn, and eventually she becomes a sort of frenemy to Johnny Blaze. And so I liked her character. And then also you have the moment where Johnny Blaze learns to use the Hellfire to create a motorcycle from the ether, as it were. Because, I mean, the motorcycle that he has initially ends up getting wrecked, and Witch Woman's the one who actually shows him how to do it, even though her power has been taken away at this point. But she teaches him how to use, the power of hell to create a new motorcycle. And even though this was a point where, even though this was under Gary Friedrich's run, and I already had issues with how he wrote things, I will say that particular moment was really cool. And so you definitely have some classic moments in that regard. And of course, you had the aforementioned bit where Tony Isabella tried to bring Jesus into the equation to help out Johnny Blaze, and the whole idea of Johnny Blaze trying to deliberately use his powers for good, as opposed to, say, just trying to save himself from hell. So you had things about the book that I liked. And as I said earlier, the artwork on hand, especially in its black and white form, is really good. It's really cool to look at. It's just that because of the constant back and forth of the creative teams, or as far as the constant derailment of whatever initial goals the creative teams had, it seems like, and the constant references to certain stories that took place outside of this book, but at the same time of this book that did involve Johnny Blaze, but they aren't available here. You have a lot of confusion, narratively speaking, at times. And so, I'm going to go ahead and give Essential Ghost Rider Volume 1. I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay. If I will say that I'm somewhat biased towards the character of Ghost Rider. In good hands, he's a really awesome character. And in fact, I was actually introduced to the character through the 90s version, Danny Ketch, through the writer of Howard Mackey, and the artists of Javier Saltras and Mark Texeria. I hope I'm saying the names right, but I mean, that was mainly how I was introduced to the character. And I actually managed to find some reprints a few years ago. I think it was called Ghost Rider Rides Again or something like that, and it reprinted the last few issues of the original series in color, and it came out around the same time as the 90s series was beginning, just to kind of get new readers caught up on what happened with the original series and how it ended and how it tied into the new Ghost Rider. And so I read that, and it was an amazing set of stories that even if you hadn't read any of the Ghost Rider issues prior to the ones that were reprinted, you felt like you were with the character who had been through hell and back. And Johnny Blaze is one of the few characters who at the time, got a well-earned good ending. Still, marked by darkness, with everything he's been through, but he was able to, essentially turn his back on the devil and walk away soul intact, and he was able to go away with the woman he loved, Roxanne Simpson, who it's so I mean, reading those, it was just like, okay, I want to check out the original series, and how things came to be. And so it was fascinating, seeing how it came to be, just in terms of how it was put to page and what have you. But just you compare the quality of storytelling that those reprints had, versus the stories in here in this particular volume. It's definitely a disappointment, because it's like it's one of those rare instances where the series seems to actually start off on a less than stellar note, but by the time it reaches its end, it ends on a wonderful note. And most of the time, it seems to be the other way around. A series starts off strong, but it ends on a less than stellar note. So in this case, it's like the opposite. So I can honestly say that this is not a good start to the series. And if you're not a Ghost Rider fan, I would say you might want to give this particular book a pass. You might, if you can, maybe try and see if you can find Ghost Rider Rides Again. It was like a 7-issue limited series that Marvel put out in the early 90s that collected the last few issues of the series. But or better yet, you might, if you want to see like Ghost Rider, in his early stages, but with a better set of, with a better quality of storytelling, the second essential volume of Ghost Rider is significantly better. The creative teams were more stable, and as a result, the character of Ghost Rider had a more clearly defined path, as opposed to, say, the constant shifting in creative teams now that's on hand here. So if you're a diehard fan of Ghost Rider, though, or if you're a fan in general, I would say this is worth picking up. But just bear in mind that just because this is the first doesn't mean it's the best. It doesn't really begin to take off until after this book, or at least after the stories in this book. But yeah, that was my take on it. I hope y'all liked my review. If y'all got any questions, comments, please let me know. If you got any, Ghost Rider related suggestions, please drop a line. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to subscribe. Thank y'all. Take care. Goodbye.